What's up, future Shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Creative practice exercises, diving into Locrian, of course, diminished territory, just ascending using a series of minor 7 flat 5, F sharp minor 7 flat 5, of course, from the G major scale. You knew that already. Of course you did. So the thing here is number one is you can sweep this entire idea and never take your pick off the strings, a la Frank Gambale style. So that's number one. Adding in that technique there obviously is really kick-ass. And of course you can adapt it over to major 7, minor 7, and dominant 7, so you can have the the 4 pillars of insanity, and then an incredibly devastating arpeggio tool. So I'm just saying, ascend using one and then descend using another one, and then you'll have basically a perfect practice session. Just keep moving around between major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, and minor 7 flat 5, and of course shifting keys, and you'll have like this absolutely insane practice tool. But it starts off obviously with just learning each of the positions, in this case Locrian, Dorian, to Lydian, to Aeolian, and then sort of stringing them together as necessary. I'm starting off in the root, right, Locrian, and then moving up into the Dorian position there, but I sort of play it in a different way. That's another part of the lesson is if all of a sudden you run into a big problem with the fingerings, just reconfigure the arpeggio so it's easier to play. In this case, move it to just 2 strings rather than trying to do some sort of sweep. The next one is even and odd groupings of notes. So the first sweep has like 5 notes, the next one has 4, the next one has 6. Right? I could go into some long-winded reason as to why you should be doing that, but first of all, it just messes with your brain. It just makes it sort of sharper with regards to sort of focusing in on the moment and doing something that feels abnormal, because a lot of the time we're always practicing in groups of 3 or 2 or whatever it is, or sequences, or everything works out perfectly. So this absolutely slaughters that. Get into it, but I think you get the idea here is that it also changes the way your solo sounds and feels. So very, very useful and powerful tool. Without doing anything, really, you're just like, oh, look, it's not so bad. I can kind of do this. You know what I mean? And yes, it's meant to be challenging. Of course, it's meant to be challenging. But that's the whole point. Once we get to the top there, I'm descending from the Aeolian position just using groups of 4, but I balance out this minor 7 flat 5 with the triad, right? The diminished triad in groups of 4, just descending in Locrian. Or sorry, in Aeolian. So when I do that, of course, I kind of balance out the flavor, if you will. You know, it's like whatever. Oh, it's too hot, it's too spicy. Cut it with something. So you use this triad, which sort of, you know, it sort of releases some of the pressure, the tension, if you will, of this previous sound, and gives you this real finger buster. Really, that's why I did it. It's just there's a lot of notes there and weird configurations, but it's not impossible, and it's got that great flavor. Of course, diminished is amazing. Get on it right now. I'm telling you, I should not have slept on it. Dominant 7's another one. These are invaluable sounds as tools in the toolbox. Don't pass them up. And of course, arranging them like this honestly has mega wow factor, because people rarely do them. So now listen, it may not come off as like, you know, the super shred, but you might use it in a different way with a bit of a swing or something like that. Trust me, it'll have the desired effect, right? So from there, and of course ending, I do the groups of 2 on the A and the low E string, right? That's really just sort of like hand-eye coordination. So doing the half step down in that sort of like tritone sequence is just really evil. You know what I mean? So for me, I'm not very good at it. I do it, and then I sort of sneak up to C, which sets me up perfectly to move into the previous 5 chord of G, D, to make that now the 1 chord. So I use diminished as a vehicle from G major to move to D major. That keeps my lick alive. Now, of course, once I move to D major, that's home base. So I got a bit of an issue there, right? So, of course, I'm going to ascend using the major 7. That's going to give it enough sauciness to sort of be like, okay, that's not boring. Just jumping into a triad arpeggio or like a major pentatonic is probably not great, right? And, of course, this one is evil. You got slides in there, a big jump, of course, and you're seeing essentially connecting a G type on the low 3 strings with an E type on the top 4 strings, right, with a few slides and all the rest of that stuff. But then, of course, from that position, I can be like, listen, I can use superimposition and now swap in the Lydian flavor. Bam. So I ascend using the Ionian flavor, but I descend using the Lydian flavor, which gives the perfect transition to move to the 5 chord of the new 1 chord I'm working in. In this case, A7. So I used D major 7, okay? And then I descended using the Lydian mode. Now, I'm going to let you figure out which one that came from, right? If Lydian's the 4 of which key, right? And then you'll have that figured out. But of course, I'm still just effectively using, you know, like similar scale shapes. So in this case, I saw Locrian there, and I was like, you know, I could just use Lydian and it would sound awesome. And it did. So there it is. You know, it wasn't even a theory choice. I was just like, it would sound better if I just went to this Lydian mode than it would if I was just going to come down using the major scale. Starting from the configuration of Locrian 3 notes per string. I hope that makes sense, I guess. But that sets me up perfectly to go to the A7. And then, of course, you see me at the end with the sort of breaking these ideas down, just playing them slower, is the evolution of the major triad into the dominant 7 to me starting to add extra notes to that dominant 7 to create an even more exotic flavor. And then finally into its, you know, bebop kind of scale form. Again, mixing and matching the odds and evens, 4 notes on one string and then 3 notes on the next string and then 2 notes is not a conventional sort of thing you would do. But honestly, there's this really great value, not just in terms of practicing, but in terms of breaking up the monotony and the sort of repetitiveness of your own practice sessions by now adding in this new sort of whatever technical hurdle. Trust me, I had to practice it several times before I could actually get it relative, and I don't even think I did a great job. It's good enough, right? But the thing is that, of course, that whole idea evolves from me using the Mixolydian position as a triad arpeggio and then the dominant 7 arpeggio in its root inversion, and then me just starting to add notes to that. That's the lesson. Not just learn this cool scale. It's that this cool scale is played at the 5th degree of a major scale, the Mixolydian mode or position, okay? And I'm using 3 notes per string in this case, effectively using the highest aspects of Lydian, because that they go on an angle, right? So in this case, it starts to overlap. So the top part's Lydian, and then I'm doing the bottom part as Mixolydian. And a few, you know, chromatic runs there. The enclosures, that's another one. If you just played the scale sequentially, you'd be like, it sounds like shit. But once you add the enclosures, where I start on one note, I do a chromatic idea, and I end on that note again before moving to the next position or the next part in the sequence, all of a sudden it works out. So without those enclosures, this idea doesn't really work as well. But once you add the enclosures, makes all the sense in the world. It's the thing there. That's the lesson. The enclosures. You're like, this doesn't work. Add an enclosure. How are you supposed to just come up with practice exercises if you're like, this one thing, I think it sounds cool, but I can't make it work? That's because you're like out of ideas, in the sense that you're like, what if I just rearrange the notes? Okay, well, rearrange them how? Go backwards? Do them out of sequence? Use an enclosure? Now all of a sudden you can advance a solution to your issue, right? And turn a frustrating practice session into something that's very useful. And you're like, all of a sudden I figured out this position. I've figured out how to evolve this arpeggio, even if you're just using that extra saucy little two-note configuration from the G string, just added to the standard sort of dominant 7 flavor, which kind of gives it this dominant 7 major 7 flavor. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just a really cool sound, almost like a major 7 raised 11 kind of deal, but with dominant overtones. You get what I'm saying there? Just that alone is really useful. And then when you start filling in the sort of the major third interval sequence with then just the standard sort of 3 notes per string stuff, and then be like, look, I can add this chromatic enclosure here. All of a sudden, you've transformed your practice sessions into something much more powerful, because you've acquired actual wisdom. You're like, if I do this and start applying this to any of the 7 positions of this scale system, I'm going to get the same results. So now it's not just learn one scale that sounds really cool. You're like, I can do that scale here. You can also do it at Locrian, when I show the second one, right? Based around the Locrian positions arpeggio. I know, shocker, right? So, you know, don't get blinded by just playing the scale part. Understand where it fits in contextually to the scale you're working in, of course. And of course, in this case, it's the A7 moving through a couple inversions. And then, of course, what I'm doing with that to sort of move the music along, right? I could have just played the arpeggio or an arpeggio sequence, but in this case, I show you how to dress the arpeggio up to turn it into a more scalar idea, but you get all the benefits, of course, of that arpeggio, which is kind of a bit of a lost art, if you will. Most people just show you a sequence or something, play this with a series of tabs. Instead, you got to train yourself to think, to be like, if I add this and I make this into an enclosure, and then I add a chromatic run here on this whole step, everything sounds much more interesting. Plus, it'll act as the pool of notes that you start drawing from on a regular basis. Doesn't matter if it's with this lick or another one, right? And so that right there is another huge benefit. You'd be like, these two right here, man, honestly, in the Mixolydian position, that makes a huge difference. So you'll start messing with that a lot more and get some really killer results, I promise you. So that's just it. It changes your focus, because you're like, I want that sound. And other times you'd be like, I want that sound. And it's just one note. You add this one note and you totally change the character of the arpeggio. And of course, using the basic music functions. I go from a major 7, the 1, to the 4, moving to the 1's 5 chord. I borrow the 4 in superimposition, right, over top of the 1 position to create the movement to get to the 5 chord. Now, I'm sure people are like, what? Stop speaking some strange language to me. That's what I'm talking about. If I'm stuck in the 1 chord, I need something else, the 4 chord or the 5 chord, to get out. Since I want to move to the 5 chord of the 1 chord, I have to use the 4 chord, right? So that's why I'm using the Lydian mode as a scale system, but that's the whole point there. It wasn't totally random, right? I realized that just going from major 7 to the major scale didn't really have a really cool impact, and I was missing this. That just moving to dominant 7, you have the standard sort of like music, you know, approach that you've heard a million times. Well, that's not helping. You're looking for fire and spark and stuff like that when you're actually practicing to be like, yeah, that's a cool flavor. That's an interesting sound. Reaching for something that you don't normally do. And by doing stuff like that, you just change your perspective and how you hear music. These two sounds bouncing off each other. There it is. That's the video. Okay, so of course you can just scale right to the end and watch the sort of me play these exercises slowly, if you will. But That would be a mistake, because these are like philosophy lessons. There's a way to think about music, and if you can think about music, you will be very successful and position yourself to be very, very successful in music at a professional level. We have a whole generation of people that don't really understand this piece, this part of it, right? And that's actually affecting how they can make music. So people find their music to be like, you know, shorts. They're entertaining for like 30 seconds or a minute or whatever else it is, but then it's just quickly forgotten. That's why people remember Eruption to this day, because it's not only technically cool and innovative, but it's also completely unique, right? It was the first to really sort of take advantage of that, you know, whatever. The technique and the sort of creative mentality necessary to employ it in that way, with the whammy bar and high gain amps and the whole 9 yards. So I you know what I mean? Like, don't ever lose sight of that. Eddie didn't sit there and learn a bunch of other people's licks. He played their music for sure and all the rest of that stuff. But does he sound like Pete Townsend? He played in a Who cover band. Does he have a lot of Pete Townsend stylings and stuff like that? He does to a certain degree when it comes to the rhythm stuff. I'll give you that. But, you know, the lead stuff is just, it's just, and then of course he just starts veering off into Eddie Van Halen territory. It's just his own entity. So, you know what I mean? I don't want this video or these videos to devolve into something where you think that the lesson is about me just, you know, showing you note by note how to play this stuff. It's not. It's thinking about balance. If you're like, those two things don't really work out, don't just continue playing them together. And realistically speaking, stop and find the thing that does work. That's the lesson, right? And then, of course, be like, how do I gain this actual knowledge? Sure, somebody can sell me a book that says 202 bebop licks, you know, for $6 on the internet. That's just this huge PDF or whatever it is. But then you start working through it, and 2 weeks later, you're just like, I can't even remember the first thing I did. I've been there. So that's why you have to start to figure it out for yourself and be like, it's easier to be like, this is the base knowledge, this simple arpeggio here, move to the 5th degree. And then I play that, and then I start filling it in, and then boom, all of a sudden you're getting the desired effect, because it's no longer just a series of numbers on a piece of paper. It has some actual physical context in relation to the instrument. So it's now something that can be used as far as knowledge, right? You have the wisdom to be like, okay, I can do this now to create that. That's the lesson. So don't ever get confused with respect to just learning things in tab and videos on how to play this perfectly or whatever else it is. That's part of it to a certain degree, but the bigger part is to master and expand your mind and look for the bigger sort of musical ticket items, if you will, you know, where you're like phrasing. What's that mean? And you know what I mean? Symmetry. And of course, asymmetry now. The idea of evolution with regards to a music idea, taking the triad and evolving it up to a bebop lick based on a position on the neck, the 5th degree in this case, or the 7th degree. The idea of kind of balancing out the arpeggio sequence. All of this stuff is far more useful to you when you're practicing, because you'll be like, start working with arpeggios and then be like, if I practice them to balance them out, I get better results, musically speaking. And now all of a sudden, you've hit your full potential. You see, without that piece of information, you learn all the shapes and it comes out sounding rudimentary every single time. But as soon as you add that into the mix, then all of a sudden a lot of doors open up. And more importantly is you actually get the results you're looking for. And you did it on your own. You didn't really need a book. So there's tons of free information on the internet and all the rest of that stuff. And I know that this video is getting really long-winded, but I don't care. That's the point. I put all the music stuff at the beginning so you don't have to listen to this. But the thing is you got to really sort of, you know, decide for yourself. Are you going to sort of learn music in sort of a way that's going to free you, to give you the wings necessary to bring your own musical vision to fruition? Or are you just going to be a cloner artist, you know, and there's just too many people doing that, which is why this channel doesn't do it. We have a million channels where they'll tell you one thing or another. This channel is asking you to basically be like, what are you going to do with your music chops? You know, are you going to put them together in the right sort of order to maximize your gains and then actually develop a certain measure of skill on the instrument where people are like, damn, that person can play? Or are you going to go the other route and just be like the basement guy that puts his videos up on social media and we're like, yeah, we pat you on the shoulder. You're like, you're doing a good job. You know what I mean? Here's your participation award. And there's even worse ones. Trust me, I saw somebody rip apart some dude now air guitaring to AI guitar music. It's just hilarious where we're going. So that's what I mean. At this point, we need you to essentially accept reality and just be like, okay, look, there's all these extra things that we're not doing anymore, and nobody's teaching this stuff anymore. Without it, your music only has a couple dimensions, and you get stuck, which is why we're producing less sort of creative guitar players. Before, we used to sit there in front of the TV and try to figure out other people's stuff. We don't do that anymore, really, because we have a mountain of instructional videos for free or that you can buy that offer a lot of promises. And don't get me wrong, they definitely have a usage, and they can, like, you shave years off your guitar sort of journey, if you will. So I'm not shooting them down, but what I am saying is there's this extra level supervisory stuff about balancing stuff out and using different ideas and using them to practice for real a bunch of sweeps into a hybrid technique, into pure sort of alternate picking, that kind of stuff, all using diminished type flavors. There you go. That's the full Monty. And then you just keep repeating that over. Okay, now move to the major. I need to come up with a new one. Major to Lydian to dominant 7. Ending in the major again, and then just with this little whole step flurry. Done. That's the whole idea in macro terms. But that's just it. When you hear it in reality, it sounds pretty impressive. But when you break it down in terms of the big macro ideas, it's not really that impressive at all, right? So it's pretty straightforward. And that's just it. Once you start looking at these big items and then you start to use that as a template, you can do so much more with your music. So don't pass it up. There it is. Video's done. Me chatting for 21 minutes. That's crazy. Haven't done that in a while. So I hope you use this information to your benefit, if you will, with regards to just practicing music and whatnot. And again, this is what breaks your practice sessions into actual real music training. It transitions you away from just being like the scale and arpeggio guy to actually starting to create real music, and then incorporating these ideas into a backing track situation when you're like, oh, if I do it over this particular chord sound, all of a sudden you're like the super shred lord, right? And that was all that was missing. You're like, that, and now I need to layer this scale over this sound. You're like, when I hear this sound, I want to use these types of scales and arpeggios. And then when I hear this sound, I want to use these ones or this one, or basically use that to set something up. Done. Right. That's the end of the video. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. I really do. I wish you the best in your practice sessions. We'll see you in the next one.